a quorum. The clock is slow and the voice has died down, so I guess it's time to begin. I'm Milt Thomas, a facilitator with the Pollution Control Agency. Welcome. It's been a couple of months now. Seems like longer. I hope you all had a great holiday. Happy New Year. Got a full agenda today, so we will get started. I just want to briefly review the trifold purpose for today. Our main purpose in meeting today is to get feedback from you on the public input process that's coming up. The other two parts of the purpose are pretty standard, that we want to continue to forge a common understanding of progress to date and clarify next steps. Kirk, do we go to you first or do we go to our representatives?
Thanks, everyone. We have one mic today, so we're going to run these around and make sure that we have it, since it is being taped for the cable broadcast. So again, thanks everyone, as Milt said. Hopefully everyone had a good holidays. Just want a quick touch base on the agenda today. We talked about the meeting purposes. We know that in the Woodbury Patch newspaper, it made it a little bit confusing about the meetings, on whether this was just about the Woodbury situation or the larger efforts. And I just want to make sure, for folks who've showed up thinking that maybe it's just a conversation about the Woodbury drinking water temporary treatment system, that's not the purpose of this meeting. The purpose of this meeting is the longer effort. We're looking for long-term solutions for all 14 communities in the East Metro area that have been impacted by PFAS contamination. These meetings are always open to the public, so everyone is welcome, but just in case folks were here for a specific purpose, we are going to talk a lot about the schedule moving forward, including the public comment process, and so that the public is very welcome, because we were interested to know how best to share information, which is soon to be arriving in people's emails, and also us sending it out to the larger public. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Monica to just give a highlight of our citizen and business work group from yesterday.
And the footage that we're getting today requires us to use the mic, so I appreciate your patience as I get to you as fast as I can.
Thank you, Milt. I'm Monica Stiglich, citizen representative from Oakdale, but the liaison to this group to report on our key discussion points yesterday. Again, we pretty much followed the outline. I think probably the key point I wanted to make was that when we got to that discussion about the public meetings, there was a lot of discussion about, well, how do you best communicate to your communities? We talked about the Nextdoor app, Facebook groups, things like that. And there was a lot of discussion on how those things can get off track, and people that are not informed on a lot of this detail can make comments and so forth that really are kind of detrimental to having this thing move forward. So we had a good bit of discussion about that. And I think that's been an ongoing challenge throughout this whole process, is getting accurate communications out to the communities. I think that was the key point. Other than that, it was very interesting to hear about the Project 1007 and the newly described foam appearance, which did wind up in the media yesterday. I think those were probably the key points. I'm looking over at Kurt to see if he's shaking his head yes, or if he had anything else he wanted to mention. Our other liaison, Kevin, is going to be a little bit late coming in, so I'm just covering this very quickly. Okay, that's all I had.
So to the point of communication, we've been talking a lot about that too, and particularly with our more recent information about Woodbury and our watching of social media, both in appreciation and horror. So what we've decided to do, and we felt we need to do, is send a direct letter to every resident, every utility bill customer, with information that we've developed. We'll have a letter from the mayor and an FAQ, which we're all very familiar with, but not everyone is connected to social media. Not everyone gets everyone gets our newsletter. Not everyone reads our newsletter. Our newsletters aren't necessarily timely. Our bills come out, every 3 months. So we're going to just do a one mailer, hit everybody, and at least that's our best attempt. And it's a personal letter from the mayor saying, you might have heard about these things. So I just wanted to share with the group that approach. So in case you have those abilities and it makes sense, you could decide whether that is something you'd want to do as well.
Thank you so much for that. Anything else? Announcements?
I think the other thing real quick then is updates. We've sent a little bit of updates in our email, but things are fast evolving, and so there are new things that have popped up that were not in the email, and Monica touched on one of them, and that is the presence of foam confirmation, that foam with elevated levels of PFAS contained in it in Raleigh Creek, and there's been the media information on that, and we're going to touch on it during the Project 1007 presentation, but I wanted just to make sure folks were aware of that. We've been working with the Department of Health to get out information, including information of specifically locations along Raleigh Creek where it was found, and then the broader communications through the media and other efforts. Again, PFAS, elevated levels found in PFAS, you can't tell the difference between natural occurring foam and that with elevated levels of PFAS in, so our message to the public is where there's known PFAS contamination is to just stay out of the foam, and that we do not believe there is a risk to human health. And we'll talk about that in more detail, but that is something if we'll make sure that as we get comments and questions from the public to share information with people. We have legislative reports, 2 of them due in February. One is just an update of this group, a 6-month report that is due to the legislature. The second one is our annual sampling report. This is the report that we do every year about sampling of private wells, the number that we sample, the number of health advisories that may have been issued as a result of exceedances of the health risk limits on those private wells, and then the number of treatment systems or alternative water that we supplied in that process. So this is an annual report that I know a lot of communities we'll get a nice wrap up, and we do break it down by community so you can see by each community what is occurring. Clint talked a little bit about Woodbury and its work to build a temporary treatment system, and I think folks may have seen earlier, we shared the newspaper article about Cottage Grove too. So both Cottage Grove and Woodbury have additional well exceedances on their municipal wells, and as a result are no longer able to address with the excess capacity in their system for the short term. And so temporary treatment systems are being developed and will be built this spring for implementation later this year. These projects are from the $40 million, the 2007 consent order that is mentioned for the temporary systems that is outside of the settlement dollars. They are being designed to be taken down after the long-term solutions are in place. And if there are questions on that too, we can have a little bit of conversation on it. I think that is the other piece. The other one, we're going to talk about conversations that we need to have with the public and how to best get out information. And I think one of the things we want you to think about before we get to that conversation is what groups or associations, what channels you use other than our normal government channels of getting information out, other than our newsletters from either the state or local level. What other conduits can you think of to help get information out as we approach this next step of the process? Any questions on those quick updates before we move on to the conceptual drinking water supply plan update with Hannah?
Hello and welcome. I think Kirk hit all the major points, substantive points we wanted to update folks on. I'm here today in place of Jess, who was unable to make it. So,
I'm told to remind our speakers to try to keep the mic close to the mouth. And now Hannah's going to, from Wood Consulting is going to talk about the plan. 10-minute briefing.
Just testing out our logistics here. Okay. So I'm Hannah. I'm with Wood Consulting, and Shalene is also here. Shalene Thomas. We're project managers for Wood, and we're the technical consultant for the MPCA through this process. So we've been tasked with, just as a review, with putting together the conceptual drinking water supply plan. We've put a model together, groundwater model, to help with that, as well as gathered information to put together a hydraulic model to model all the infrastructure in the area. So just a brief update there. So what I'm going to talk about today, hopefully get through rather quickly so we can have more discussion about kind of the next steps forward. But I'll just go over, a little bit about what we had released to the work groups and subgroup so far as the partial results. Since we didn't have the groundwater model yet, we, put together some of the results that we could put together and release that just as to kind of, prep the groups for what they would receive later, the full results. Then I'll talk a little bit about the groundwater model and then talk about what our next steps are for Wood to kind of work with MPCA to finish out the conceptual drinking water supply plan. So again, the scenarios that we had released so far have been the 2020 status quo scenario where everybody keeps their same system and we just add treatment on a well by well basis. And I'll get into a little more detail on those. And then the regional options that we had released were one large surface water treatment plant, 2 surface water treatment plants, and then also connecting the whole East Metro to St. Paul Regional Water. So for the treatment scenarios, again, we had the HI categories, so the health index, which if you remember is kind of an additive way for the Department of Health to, kind of add, instead of going contaminant by contaminant, they're able to, take the contaminant concentrations that they're seeing in the well, they'll divide that by the health levels that the department has set, and then add those together. So if they are in excess of 1 at the moment, that's when it triggers kind of additional work that, if it's a private well, they're going out and putting GAC systems on, or in the case of municipal wells, then the city has to kind of work with the MPCA to determine the best path forward. So we set up different categories where, we would treat wells, only the wells above HI of 1, and then we kind of stepped down from there. So then we said, okay, we're going to add to that wells with an HI of 0.5 as well, or above 0.5, and then also wells with PFOS, PFOA, PFHX above 0. And then just all the PFAS, the 5 that we have criteria for from the Department of Health. What if all of those were above 0? Or any of them, I should say. So those are the different categories that we looked at. So obviously, from left to right, you're kind of increasing in price. The price tag, as far as capital costs to add a system to that well, or that number of wells, as well as O&M costs. So we used all of the sampled wells so far, and then added to that a number of wells that we kind of were inferred using the best guess from the information the Department of Health has, and Ginny Yingling was a big help with that, just to kind of, over the next year, obviously they will be sampling more and more, and I think they said that about 1,000 wells a year get sampled, so of that 1,000 wells, how many do we think over the next year are going to exceed those values? And so we kind of got a rough guess there per community, and added those to what we know so far, concentration-wise. So then, sorry these are hard to see at the bottom, but there's a couple of notes here, just one saying that for municipal wells, the the concentrations are a 4-sample average as opposed to using the most recent concentration from those wells. And then also the data that we have on the POET GAC systems that have been installed, so the point of entry treatment systems, that's what that stands for. So those are on like a residential well. That data set is from October. So just a note there that we're using those. We weren't including the costs for the installation, or the capital costs for installing those since they were already installed, but we did include O&M costs moving into the future. So for the regional scenarios, again, we had the 3 kind of main options here, and then just a note that for the second option where we're looking at 2 different regional surface water plants, there was 2 options within those. One where Woodbury was served by the Mississippi plant, and one where Woodbury was served by the St. Croix plant. So for those, we had we sized the systems for those 2040 demands. So we weren't using like a 2020 versus 2040. We just sized them all for 2040 demands. And then also, we didn't obviously have the groundwater model, so just a note that the analysis using the groundwater model was not possible and not factored into those costs at all. So the groundwater model is complete now. We moved through these steps a while back. We had some setbacks with the groundwater model, but the model is complete, and we're now able to start using that to help with our scenarios. So if anybody has any questions there, just let me know. Feel free to stop me. Sure.
Sorry, it's my nature. I can't get away from it. So in the treatment scenario, are you talking about treating just those areas above the health index? And the reason why I ask this is part of our position has been treatment of wells that are above the health index for sure, but also this thing is moving, grooving, changing, and we need protection. So does the treatment, so I assume the treatment is basically non-regional, it's local, but does it assume protection, or does it assume only dealing with contaminated wells? Because that's a big difference.
Yeah, so it's a little, just getting into a little more details, so it requires a lot of background information. So I apologize for those of you in the room who maybe haven't seen, our scenarios that we've put forth before. But so the treatment scenario that I'm talking about here is where, we're just assuming that everybody stays as is. And like I said, we're applying treatment on a well-by-well basis. So within those different categories, obviously the one where we're only treating wells with HI over 1, then that's a limited set of wells. But then we also cost it out all the way down to wells that have any detection. So that last category includes all wells with any PFAS detections. Does that answer your question?
So I think that's going to be a really flawed assumption, because what you're going to do is you're going to set communities apart by those that have treatment and those that don't. And it'll be left to the consumer to figure out, does my home that I'm looking to buy or retain have treatment, and does that differentiate that home and that property value and that marketability and that neighborhood from others? And so part of the statements I've made repeatedly is that doing treatment on a above health index level or at a DTEC level is really a flawed assumption, because our communities will be divided. There'll be divisions within our communities. It'll have market effects. And then this plume, as we know, is changing all the time. We won't be able to add the protection element that someone says, I may not have it now. I don't know if it's going to happen in the future. So I think to put the regional plants on par with the treatment, there needs to be some element of an assumption that if you're in the East Metro area, and I'm not talking about Woodbury, I'm talking about the whole area, every home, whether it's through an individual GAC system, you know, if you're on a private well or you're part of a municipal system, you have protection through treatment irrespective of the levels. And that would be the thing I continue to advocate for, and to not have that as a scenario, you know, really concerns, because we get into disparities, and if disparities also follow lines of income, we could end up with a real social economic problem.
Yeah, so I guess, I don't know if you guys want to comment on that.
So just looking at the scenarios on, thanks for flipping back there. The health index over 0, I believe, then would look at treatment for every municipal well. The total number of wells for Woodbury is 19, right? And under HI greater than 0, all 19 receive treatment. So I think we're seeing through all these scenarios, because then St. Paul Park is 3, Oakdale is 8, even Newport comes up on that list then 2, Lakeland 2, Lake Elmo 4, Cottage Grove 12. So you do see a scenario where every municipal well is receiving treatment under the HI1. And so we do have that costed out. I can't say that's the case with every private well, because although it could be close, because we have 2,200 wells that are over there, in addition to what's out there already. So we're getting close to what is that number. So that HI over 0 is a very encompassing piece. But again, this is just a desktop analysis on this one. We get into more details in the other scenarios, and I know Hannah's going to talk a little bit more about how we're progressing on those.
Yeah, and I will say that, you know, obviously the in-home systems that have been installed so far have been driven by sampling. So, you know, the Department of Health, I should say, hasn't installed wells at, you know, any other homes other than the ones that they've sampled and they know is above the health index of 1. So I think that's, you know, if we were to put an in-home system on every private well, that would require, I'm pretty sure, the whole budget, if not more, of what we have in the settlement. Shalene has her hand up back there, so.
No, what we really need for the broadcast, if you can.
I just wanted to reiterate where we started and why we came up with the scenarios, that we identified the scenarios in this treatment scenario 2020 as a bookend of, you know, we don't know how far the money is going to take us collectively, which is why we're doing all of the scenarios. The intention of this one was to say, okay, what if we just gave everybody who, quote, quote, needs treatment now, that treatment, how far will the money go? So I think we need to keep that in mind and be cognizant of the objective of having a 2020 treatment scenario option. And that's the intent, to look at it from that perspective of, if we did that now, how far will we get with the funding?
Sure, yeah, sorry. Okay, I'm going to move it along just for the sake of time, but, you know, we'll be probably talking a little more in depth at the subgroup meeting as well, just getting into a little more technical detail, but I know we'll be having this discussion more and more. So, and I want to talk a little bit more about the rest of the scenarios as well, because I think that they help, they help kind of cover the gamut of options and price points and all that. So these are, we had these 4 scenario groups. I'll just run through them real quick. So the treatment scenario, again, was the status quo. Everything stays the same. We just add treatment where necessary with the different HI categories. We have a community-specific scenario. So that one, and I think this harkens maybe to your point, good or bad, but some of the communities had indicated that they would like treatment on all of their wells regardless of the HI value. So in this community scenario, we're looking at that and doing more of like a, looking at different options, not just putting treatment at the well, but also doing like centralized treatment and that kind of thing. So the community specific scenario is one where the community, voiced their opinion, gave us ideas on what they would like to see implemented in their community. And it also kind of keeps those political boundaries, so you're not combining systems for communities. So then the regional scenarios, like I said, we've got surface water options that I went through before, and we're also looking at a couple of groundwater options. So one where we're putting in one large groundwater field to serve, or well field, I should say, to serve the whole East Metro, and then one where we're looking at doing multiple well fields, so 2 to 4, basically, well fields, and hopefully placing those in places where maybe we wouldn't need treatment, or less treatment, or maybe it needs treatment, but it's closer to the existing infrastructure, so there's some cost savings there. So then the integrated scenario would be kind of using the lessons learned and information that we're finding from the rest of these scenarios, and Wood is putting together scenarios that look at kind of anything else. There were conceptual projects submitted, so we're taking all those conceptual projects that are left over that weren't, fitting into the rest of these buckets, and looking at those as well. So this is sort of our percent complete, and talks a little bit about, what we're looking at with the groundwater model, how we're using that. And then, so going into a little more detail, with the 2040 treatment scenario, so this is one that we had left that, we didn't present to you guys because we needed the groundwater model. So, same as before, except now we're, instead of adding wells just through 2020, now we're looking at the groundwater model to say, how is the groundwater moving, and how do we think that that is going to impact, PFAS movement. And just a note here that where we're predicting, we'll say, that the groundwater may move the PFAS to, up through 2040 and possibly beyond. Those wells that then may be impacted due to that movement, we don't really know what concentration that would end up being. So we would just assign them to all of those HI categories. So the variability that exists with the costs associated with the HI categories currently, that would only be recognized from the 2020 analysis and the existing samples that we know now, and the additional wells that we would, say that we think might be contaminated in the future, those would be just added to those categories across the board. So there wouldn't be any additional variability that we'd be able to see from this analysis. So for the way that we're doing that is using particle tracking. So you can do that a couple different ways. I was just pointing that out here, where you can look at if there's contamination in one well, where do we think, where is that moving based on the hydrogeology? Or you can say, okay, I want to put a well here. You can reverse particle track to see what is influencing that well, or what could potentially influence that well up gradient. For regional scenarios, I went through these already, but just a note on the groundwater model. We'll be looking back at these surface water scenarios to see what happens when we turn all the municipal wells off, since those are now relying on surface water. They won't need their groundwater wells pumping all the time anymore. So how does that impact the overall movement of groundwater in the aquifers? And then obviously for the groundwater scenarios, we'll be using the groundwater model to evaluate where to place the well fields and what impacts those might have. So like I said, for community specific, these are the options that the community has set forth. We've got all of their existing infrastructure models, in our modeling software, and we're using that to kind of build on to analyze these scenarios. So some of the challenges are the contamination, obviously. Where could we put a new well that the community might need that, maybe won't need treatment, so we'll save them costs. And then we've got some regulatory challenges as well as availability and kind of physical characteristics of the hydrogeology as well. So like I said, for integrated scenarios, this is where we're kind of using all that previous knowledge to develop other scenarios. So it involves, combining systems. So examples are, having a Cottage Grove, Gray Cloud Island, St. Paul Park, all in one system. And what does that look like? What are the cost implications? Also, West Lakeland is looking at, since they have pretty extensive contamination and a lot of people are affected, looking at putting them on a combined system, maybe with Lakeland. And then also for Maplewood, we've been primarily, their primary option was to connect to St. Paul Regional Water, but another option might be to connect them to Woodbury or Newport systems. So another note on the, just at the top, sorry. So we had kind of talked about doing neighborhood systems, so these small systems where a neighborhood gets together and say, we want to drill a well and put treatment on it, and we'll all use the water and kind of develop an association to maintain and all that. So we've done a cost comparison on that and found that, installing POETs on an individual home basis is much more cost effective. So we kind of eliminated that as an option just because of the huge cost difference. And so that'll be part of the write-up that you'll see when the plan comes out. So that's kind of sums up the where we're at right now. Just a quick timeline here. This week we're starting to run the groundwater model for these scenarios. We'll be presenting those results to the PCA and DNR the week of February 3rd. And then the week of February 10th, that week before the next set of work group meetings, is when we hope to release those results to the work groups and subgroup. So that's all for me. Any burning questions before I turn it over? I don't want to take up too much more time.
What's your model review time? So what's your model? So this is all guided by the behind the curtain model. So what's the review? So how are we as local government units going to evaluate the model? What sort of time will we have to evaluate the model? Is there a peer review for the model? Do you have some scoping information for the model? I mean, the model is, frankly, the wizard behind the curtain that none of us as LGUs have any information on. And if that model is going to drive decisions and frameworks, then I think the LGUs really need to understand the model, not today, but the aspects of it. Again, what's the scope of it, the peer review of it, how big a place this has. So I think we need a whole, whether it's a write-up, but we need something about the model itself, because I'm hearing from you that's a crucial piece of what drives a conceptual drinking water plan.
So I will say we've been working really closely with Department of Natural Resources as well as the Geological Survey. Yeah, I mean almost on a weekly, daily, hourly basis on some days. They have a lot of experience. They've put together several models themselves, and so we've been relying heavily on them, and they've been vetting it throughout the process, so over the last 9 months. But Steve was wanting to.
Like you did in the other group about the three things that the model could do, and then just talk a little bit more about who has been a part of it, because it's more than the DNR.
Right, yeah, so we have weekly meetings with the DNR and the Geological Survey, MPCA, Department of Health has been there throughout the process to guide that as well. So yeah, the model is being used, like I said, to determine where we can put wells. where's the availability in those aquifers, which aquifers can we use, should we put, should we diversify maybe in the placement of the wells, so maybe put in one well field, have one well in a shallower aquifer and one in a deeper, just to have a little bit of diversity for the community in case, something may happen in the future. And then also, like I said, with the particle tracking, looking at, how the contamination might move. So we don't have a lot of fate and transport information in order to do a fate and transport analysis where we're really looking at, what concentration will be at this point on this day. We don't know that for sure, but we can tell how the groundwater is moving, and so we can make some assumptions that the PFAS will move like the groundwater as well. And I don't know what the third one was that that I had spoken to yesterday. Yeah, okay, I think that was pretty much it.
Surface water, groundwater. It's surface water, groundwater. It's groundwater levels, and then it's the particle tracking. I think those are the three things. Normally, Clint, we have been kind of peer reviewing on the fly, as Hannah described, using modeling resources from the other agencies. I think the model's in a condition that we can provide to cities at this point, or communities if desired, so that their consultants or their staff can take a look at it. I anticipate that we'll provide some sort of a summary overview of the model. We typically do that. We certainly did that with the White Bear Lake model when that came out. So, we don't intend for things to be opaque, but it took a while to get the model developed to a stage where we could kind of lay it out and provide it.
Yeah, so just speaking to that point, I forgot to mention, we have put together documents so far that will be part of the plan as appendices. So there'll be an appendix where we have a conceptual site model that kind of lays out all the data that we've collected and the geology for the area and kind of just setting the stage. And then there'll be a numerical model document that describes like how we set up the model, what kind of software we use and what assumptions we made there. So there'll be a documentation provided. So that would be part of, I would say, a peer review from, these groups and the subgroup where, you're able to provide feedback on, how you feel the model was put together and if there's any issues that you feel necessary to bring up.
And then include SG1 conversation. I think those folks are going to, more so than the work groups, understand the finer details of the model, to have that conversation there also so that everyone understands. And that's the groundwater model. And there has been some conversation, SG1, about the groundwater model. And also the other model is the drinking water model, where we took all of your models of your systems and combined them together for one, lack of a better term, Uber drinking water system model of the region. So those are the two models.
Any more questions? Okay, we'll turn it over to others.
Terrell, just to make sure that we're clear, part of what I thought I heard Clint asking is what provisions are for the LGUs to review this, and my understanding, based on what I've heard so far, is it'll be through the work group meetings and the subgroup meeting unless there's some other arrangement made. Is that accurate?
Correct. We'll be sending out documentation with the plan, which will be the first level to be able to dive into the details. We're going to have a follow-up conversation, more likely in the subgroup one. We're going to talk a little bit here about the time frames, and you'll see how there are a number of months between stages that will allow for adequate time for looking at the results of the models, but also the model themselves, to be able to comment on 2 rounds that we're going to have, a very all-encompassing round and a more limited recommendation round. So keep that in mind too, and if you think there's a better time to have a certain meeting, for instance, on the groundwater model during this process, please let us know.
All right, and now Terrell from Apt Consulting is going to just briefly give you some context and then solicit your input on the public input process.
Great, thank you. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Terrell Holweg. I'm with Apt Associates. And as we mentioned earlier, we wanted to spend a good amount of time at today's meeting to talk about the public input process. Oh, it's. Thanks. All right, so as Kirk mentioned, that we are planning to have a series of public meetings over the next few months to provide updates on where we are with the conceptual drinking water supply plan. So today we wanted to present to you all what our initial thoughts are for this public engagement process over the next few months, and then really dive in and hear some feedback from you if you think this is the right process, if we're engaging the public at the right times, if we're asking the right questions. Kirk also mentioned earlier the different channels that we could use to try to get as much kind of broad communication as possible. So we really wanted to hear from you, since we all know that you do this a lot already, on how best to engage the public. So again, I'm going to walk through currently what we're thinking, but really wanting this to be a discussion and hear from you so we can update this. And we did hear a lot of good feedback from the citizen business group yesterday. So I think for the slides that we presented, I think a lot of this, or there'll be already some changes that we're going to make to this. And I'll try to highlight at least some of those comments that we heard yesterday as we go through it. All right. All right, so I'll be walking through the process by month. So we do have a lot of stuff kind of packed into every month. So bear with me here. As Hannah said, that we will be presenting the preliminary results summary, so the full scenario results, to the work groups and the subgroup in early February. And this will be just the results, so it won't be presenting the evaluation of the scenarios or the recommendations at this time. It'll just be the results. And then we'll plan to walk through those results at our work group and subgroup 1 meetings in February. And then pretty soon after that, we are planning to have what we're calling informational and listening sessions. So we're planning to have 6 of these meetings. So we'll have, it'll be 3 days of meetings. So we'll have 2 meetings in a day, 1 in the afternoon and 1 at night. And we have at 3 different locations around the East Metro area. So the first meeting will be in Woodbury, the next meeting will be in Lake Elmo, and the third meeting will be in Cottage Grove. And at these meetings, we will be presenting the scenario results, so really what we have found with what Wood is doing with the modeling. And then we do want to hear back from the public to get their feedback on these scenarios. So we do have a list of questions. We did hear a good amount of comments from the citizen business group yesterday on some changes to these questions, so I think that these will likely be updated. But these were initial thoughts, asking if they live or work in the impacted area, if they have a private well, and how they feel about connecting to a public water system, how they feel about utilizing an alternative water supply source, such as surface water, how much money should be set aside for operations and maintenance, or if money should be set aside for operations and maintenance, and if so, for how long, if there's other projects that they had in mind besides the one that we presented here, and then asking about if they have any thoughts on just the benefits of this plan and this effort. We did hear from the work group, from the citizen business group yesterday, to try to bin these questions into different groups, so maybe focused on some of just the general kind of project components, on the operation and maintenance piece, and so on. So I think we'll try to tweak some of these, but I'll stop here. We do have more information going through the next months, but are there any initial thoughts for February?
I'm not sure I understand. So, like, what's the format? When you have all these questions, I mean, is it going to be just wide open, anybody can come, and you're going to ask this as groups, to the whole group, or will there be kind of smaller meetings, or can you kind of expand on that? When you ask such detailed questions like that, it feels a little different than your previous public meetings.
Yep, that's a good point. So I think that that we're thinking that this would be, we'll have a presentation part of the meeting, and then we'll also have a more open house, so having some poster boards to walk through the different scenarios. I think with these questions, we're still trying to talk about the best way to get the feedback. One of our thoughts was having some kind of asking people to type some of their answers into a smartphone, so we actually try to get answers from everyone in the audience if they're willing. Or, you know, we could also have, have people come up and provide their comments one by one. So we've talked about that.
I think another key part is what we've been doing with a couple of the Volkswagen settlement and the clean car proposals, where you put up values. We're not going to be able to go through every scenario because there's going to be, 50 or so plus iterations of it with the public, but tee up the questions of, for instance, if you're in West Lakeland, system on your home, an individual system, or moving to a municipal system, or bring up some of those questions so that they're comparing which do they value more. You could do it as a dot matrix. We've seen it very successful with smartphones. I just actually went into my county library, Dakota County. They have there that same thing, one poster board, which is FAQs, background information, and then they ask the question and they ask folks to put in that information. So this will help us, those big questions that we've all been struggling with and trying to figure out which is the best way to go, also pose those to the public versus saying, do you like scenario 4B, iteration 3? Because that's just going to get into a depth that they're not familiar with. And then this feeds into question 20 of the criteria. What is the public acceptance to start getting that information? If there are technologies you've used, like the smartphone or the dot matrix on boards, let us know what others have been successful for you.
Another thing that we have talked about is starting to develop a web page specifically for the conceptual drinking water supply plan. So having a source of information there for folks to look at prior to the meeting, and also have some fact sheets there as well. So then we can have some FAQs for folks, and hopefully provide them with a little bit more background before they come to this meeting.
I think it might, it's hard to tell how much information you might get from some of these questions, like how do you feel about, it would be helpful to ask some why questions, I think, as part of that, because you want to know, well, I hate it. Well, okay, why? And then your last question, what do you see as the biggest benefit of this plan? I think there's the other question is, what do you think is the biggest, what's your biggest concern about this plan?
Any other thoughts, or should I continue? All right, so that will be February. So then moving into March, this is where the trustees will be evaluating the scenarios using the priority 1 criteria that we developed, and also working to help to start determining their good, better, best recommendations. During the same time period, the co-trustees will be meeting with the LGUs to discuss these recommendations to help inform their final decision on that. And then at the work group meetings in March, we won't be able to present the evaluation results at this point, but we hope to discuss, have a discussion on the informational listening sessions that we had in February, to share our thoughts on what we heard from those meetings, and if you all are there as well, to get your thoughts as well. And another thing to mention is that we do, as part of the evaluation, we do have that 1 criteria related to public acceptance. So we're hoping to use these informational sessions to help inform the rating of that specific criteria. So I think we'll be hoping to dive into that at this meeting as well. All right, and then in April, sorry, we do have a lot of stuff on this slide, so I'll try to walk through it piece by piece. So again, the co-trustees will still be meeting with the LGUs to discuss the good, better, best recommendations. We plan to release a draft of the conceptual drinking water supply plan to the work groups in early April, which will include the good, better, best recommendations. And then we will be discussing that draft plan at the work group meetings in April. We also plan to release a draft conceptual drinking water supply plan to the public at this same time, and then formally request public comments on the draft plan. And then again, this will include the co-trustees' recommendations. And then we'll plan to have a 30-day comment period from middle of April to middle of May to receive those public comments. And we're planning to use Survey Gizmo, that same online application form that we've used before to get public ideas for projects, and sometimes we've used it internally with these work groups. Oh yes, and while we're going, we know that there's a lot of moving pieces here, so we are planning to provide updates through Gov Delivery to the public, and then we're also hoping to get the information out through other venues as well. We did talk about yesterday about using the Nextdoor app, Facebook, doing press releases, getting information in newspapers. So I think we are hoping to use a variety of different avenues to get this information out to folks. But if you all have additional thoughts on on other channels to use and what you have found to be effective, that would also be useful. But those are the standard ones that we've talked about so far.
For those who may be watching or in the room, how do you sign up for Gov Delivery?
I may have to turn that over to Liz.
Hi, everyone. My name is Liz Koffenberg. I'm a coordinator for the settlement. We have a webpage, 3msettlement.state.mn.us, and on that webpage, you can sign up for Gov Delivery notices just by submitting your email address.
And you essentially get email updates, is that right? Okay. So then we'll be releasing the draft plan for public comment, and then we'll also plan to have 2 public meetings to go through the draft plan and the recommendations by the trustees. And we're thinking to have these at the end of April. Again, we have some questions that we've developed. So did you attend an informational session in February? Do you have an impacted water supply? Do you have any thoughts, concerns with a conceptual drinking water supply plan? Seeing the cost for O&M, are you comfortable with what is planned to be set aside for the future? And what do you see as the biggest benefit of this plan? And then also, what are your concerns with the plan? All right, and then moving on, so then in May, we plan to finalize the conceptual drinking water supply plan, which will include the final decision. And then also host some public meetings to present that final plan and the final decision. And then at this time, then we'll be going into the implementation phase and starting to enter into funding agreements. So those are our current thoughts. So we did have some questions for you all. So do you think we're getting enough public input at the right times? Well, we already talked about some of the questions here. You know, what information would be helpful to present in one format, and then also, as Kirk mentioned earlier, you know, what kinds of channels are useful to use to get this information out? Are there specific user groups that we should be targeting? So on.
I'm Lowell Johnson with Washington County. The question I have, I guess, is kind of the nuance between civic engagement, public engagement, and then kind of more formal local government entity endorsement or support or that kind of thing. So I think what you've outlined here primarily is kind of open forum, invitational kind of community opportunities to have dialogue. But I think we also know that there's, I think when you get into the April timeframe, March, April, you said you would be meeting individually with local units of government. Do you envision those to be conversations with Clint and a staff member and maybe the mayor kind of thing, or do you envision that to be more of a public discourse with the council? And then and where and when is there some point where the local units of government, a city, a township, the county board, are asked to endorse the conceptual plan in a more formal way? Because I think you get a different dialogue, you get a different set of constituents that come to that meeting. People then feel like they're saying yes or no to something rather than giving input. So and there's always that dynamic in public process where people want to know that they're kind of I thought we said no to that, or I thought we said yes to that. And how do you intend to manage some of that formality of endorsement of a plan, or the city council action on a plan, or something like that? Maybe we're not there yet. I don't know, but I'm starting to think ahead to those things.
So I think there's a couple layers here. The February is collecting all the information from folks, just general information about the topics to be able to get into the recommendations. And so for the public, that's going to be through the listening sessions, and we'll still have our email address and that on our website to get information. For the local units of government, it's through these working groups. You see 2 meetings in that listening session part where this work group is still involved. One is where we're presenting it in February, and you have about a week to have a little bit, and then you've got a whole month, and we come back to you again to get more information from you before finalizing any recommendations. That's that more informal outreach. The next round then is that formal process of the 30-day public comment period, the one-on-ones with the local units of government. It's up to the local governments and the government units how they would like to have that conversation. For instance, we have had, with everyone, we've had invites for one-on-ones, and sometimes it has been the mayor and some of the staffs. Some cities, it's just the mayor has shown up. Some, it's a good chunk of staff, the mayor, and maybe a couple city council members. We've been before the Prairie Island Council, the full council. So that really is up to the organization how they best want to be interacted with. And so we're open to that. The formal comment period is an opportunity, and we anticipate not only citizens but local units of government putting in formal comments, and that's really where it's going to then be narrowed down to good, better, and best, so that it'll be, you can really get some of that thumbs up, thumbs down, maybe this way with tweaks. And we've done this in layers for a couple reasons. We know when we first put out the information, there may need to be tweaks. People need to see the groundwater model, understand the groundwater model before really just diving in and say, okay, here's all the information. We just dropped, 100-some pages on you of the high-level summary and, thousands of pages of technical summary. You got a month to tell us what you think. So we're trying to ease this in not only citizens, but the local units of government. So I think that kind of hits those pieces if I've missed any of them, and that's what we want to hear. One other thing about the meetings we didn't mention, we want to make them regionalized too. So when we're in Lake Elmo, talk about the whole plan, but also talk specifically about Lake Elmo and probably West Lakeland, Afton, those communities too, because there really aren't big venues there to host meetings. In Woodbury, it's talking about the big picture, but also about Woodbury. We don't know where these fault lines are, so if you think there are better ones, maybe Oakdale and Newport. And Cottage Grove, talk about certain neighboring communities, so that it's a mix of the big picture, but also we can dive into the citizens in that area and see what they're thinking. Again, that's draft. If you think that will just fail or really work well, we want to hear now to see how you've done some of these things, especially on a county level. I know, Clint, you've talked about the gold line and how some of those conversations have been done regional and then tying back to local government. If you see things that worked well in those processes, please let us know.
So when you do that public feedback stuff here in February, then will there encourage you a way then to identify where those public comments are coming from. Like you said, it'll be regional, but it might be helpful to have it broken down between what the folks in West Lakeland think versus the folks in Lake Elmo or wherever else they may be coming from, just so that we can be able to communicate that public preference specifically back to our elected officials.
Get another mic soon, sorry.
So if you can give me some advice, one of the things that's rolling through my head, and maybe it was yours too, Lowell, is at what point do I engage my elected body? So if you were to say, look at the schedule, which is really well laid out, and your public input process, I like everything you've shown, what would be the range you would say you want to have your elected body look at this, get educated on this, and start to weigh in? So that's my first question. My second question, since we only have one mic, is will good, better, best have different funding levels tied to good, better, best? You know, good, you get X percent. Better, you get Y percent. Good, better, best, you get Z percent. So are you thinking that funding follows that, or is it just simply a way to sort of demark the different options? I'm not trying to. I just want to understand. So where would be the good slot to engage our councils? Besides all the time.
He just answered. No, I think it's going to depend on your council in how much they want to get into the weeds of it, and it really is different. Some cities have passed citywide resolutions on parts. Some have shared it through the one-on-one conversations in here. So I don't think we can say one way or the other. It really is, how do you interact? How does your council, how do your government bodies work best with the information? I would encourage, I would start giving them some of the high-level stuff as we start producing it for the public meetings to the council in that late February, where we have some more of that document so they can start perusing it. And then if in March, when we come back to this work group, whether you are advocating or speaking about what you're getting from your staff in that or from your elected bodies, that's up to you. And then we'll be having those conversations with the local units of government. And obviously, they'll need to be weighed in coming that March and April. But I would anticipate some background information being provided to them in February. So that was question one. Question two, I have forgotten. I'm sorry.
Just forget it. Wipe it from your head.
Oh yeah, the good, better, best. All the above. So we have been looking at that. I think, as we envision this, there will have to be not only what's done, but how the funding packages for it is done. So good, better, and best could be broken up by different ways to deliver drinking water to communities, but two of them could be similar ways on how they deliver drinking water, but different ways it's funded, so that more can be used for other parts of Priority 1, or more goes to long-term pieces. So I think part of the listening session, you see on some of those questions, where we're going to try to tease up for folks a lot of money spent up front, so there's capital cost and not much O&M. That'll help us to determine, how some of those funding mechanisms are. Also, the question of other things in Priority 1. So there's the drinking water. There's the overall supply issue of the drinking water that's underneath, and how do we protect that? In the sustainability, how do you kind of put some of this in buckets? So I think we're still going to see and hear where some of those natural breaking points are after we see the results and we see what the comments are from the public and the local units of government. So I can't say for sure it's going to be one way or the other, but any way we do this, we are anticipating this is the capital cost, this is the O&M, or anything else that we put money away, so it's very clear to folks up front what they're getting in the good, better, best, so they can make some of those long-term decisions.
Any other thoughts, questions?
You've probably thought about this already and in other meetings that you've had, public meetings, but the question that I had is how much information as contextual information are you thinking about providing at these meetings so that the public has enough context to answer the questions that you're asking?
Great. I can start, and then maybe Kirk, you can add. Yeah, so I think we do realize that a lot of the public will be coming into this pretty cold. So we do have to really take a step back and provide the bigger picture. Like we said, we will be developing a website or a web page specifically for this. So trying to provide the bigger picture of what we're doing here. And trying to get it to more simple language. We're hoping to develop fact sheets for this as well that we'll be handing out at the meeting. We plan to have posters, both posters specifically on the scenarios, so each of the scenarios and walking through those, but then a couple posters that provide the bigger picture as well to give them a sense about what we're doing. And then I think the presentations too will be walking through the entire process that we've done to date, and then where we are now and what the next steps are. So I think a couple different ways for us to try to make sure that we're clearly presenting what we're doing here, and so there's try to avoid any confusion that may happen from it. Kirk or Steve, did you want to add?
I just wanted to point, this is something that came up in the Citizen and Business group, a real conversation about the desire for FAQs, fact sheets, as Terrell's mentioned, to understand and get the background, and also get that out before the public meeting. So folks want to do some type of background research before going to public meetings to get that out. So that's something we heard loud and clear from the Citizen and Business group. And I don't know, Monica, if there's anything you want to add to that or flavor from that conversation.
This wasn't necessarily in the conversation, but one of the burning things in my mind is still a really good fact sheet about this whole health index thing and what we actually know right now about these compounds. I still have people that I see in the grocery store buying distilled water. Why do you buy it? I buy it for the coffee machine and the CPAP machine. Why are you buying it? Oh, I have to cook with it because we have poisoned water. And it ain't so. And so I think that whole thing about, I think there's, Department of Health help me there, really get a good solid fact sheet out for, okay, what do we really know about the health impacts? Again, there's a lot we don't know. There's a lot of studies going on. But I think, the community really needs to understand, okay, why did we get all this money out of 3M in the first place? Well, we know it's a persistent forever chemical, but, so what? I mean, we really need to really have something solid there. And I personally need it because people know I'm working on this thing, and I need to have something I can pull out of my hip pocket to respond with too.
So you answered my first question. I'm glad things are going to get out early because I do think with as complicated as this is, it's going to be hard for people to come to a meeting and give their feedback. And so then on the other side of it too, I wonder if there's a way that these questions could be posted online or something so that they could, again, have that opportunity to digest the information and still provide that feedback so that it's not like you got to do it within this 1 hour or 3 hour kind of meeting thing. So both on the front end and on the back end, just to make sure that we're giving them enough time to fully digest it all.
Thanks. Any other thoughts? Oh, yeah. So if you do have any other thoughts after you leave the meeting next week, feel free to send any additional thoughts to Walker, and he'll forward it on to all of us.
Is this going to be on the website?
Yep, it will be. All right, how are we doing with time? Oh.
We're doing good with time.
Just one quick thought on some of the questions. For example, how much money should be set aside for long-term operations? I mean, that might be best if it's if you give them choices of percentages. Yeah, I mean, people aren't going to know actual dollar amounts, but I mean, give them like 3-4 choices, ranges or something, 0 to 10%, 25% or less, something like that, just to get ballpark, because I don't know that otherwise anybody's going to be able to answer that kind of a question. But any kind of those helpful, what would be helpful for you in that response to know percentages or some apportionment of that kind of thing, and you can always leave other if they want to do something. But I think those kinds of helpful things to help you get good usable information at the end of it, and then also to make the process a little easier for somebody who's not been at this table for a long period of time.
I think that this is going to be really tough for people to comment on. There are questions that are good questions for the public to weigh in on. I think getting people to weigh in terms of what part of the settlement should be for an O&M and what should be capital, that's really tough. I mean, it's going to be based on how much we're going to spend on the capital. I continue to have a concern that this fund lives a long, long time, and we love you at the state, but we would like to have a settle up period and move on. And so one of the things I'm hoping you'll have as an option is what I would call an O&M settle up. So whatever we end up with in terms of our own individual treatments, there's much like 3M settled with the state, decided a value, and then state moved its way and 3M moved its way. I would like the same opportunity as a community that, we decide what the capital cost is, total that up, how much is left over. There's a settle up for the balance so that we as cities don't have to keep coming back to the state again and again and again with requests for reimbursement, and you don't have to keep a fund for a long time with all the administrative options. So I'm hoping that's an option you're thinking about, just an O&M settle up based on each one of our own risk profiles and operating impacts. But I'm not sure that O&M versus capital is a good citizen question.
Great, thanks.
Just briefly, Clint, to that point, we have looked at that, and I've also started having conversations with our fiscal folks and legal folks on what, if we were to choose that option, say, estimate what 20 years of O&M is, to then put that towards any system to a community to have that in a trust or something, what that would look like, just to see if it's possible, what it would look like. So it is something we are discussing and trying to understand the finer details behind it on how that would work. So if you have thoughts on that too, on what that system might look like, it is part of the conversation. It doesn't mean we've made a decision one way or the other on it, but it is something we are definitely looking at.
All right. Anything else? All right. Well, great. Thank you very much for your thoughts.
Okay, we are ahead of schedule, which I know you have other things you'd probably like to get to before noon, but before we take a break, we have some time here if there are any questions or comments from the public. Can you use the microphone, please?
Hi, Tom Johnson from Clean Water Action. I guess I got a couple things. One is just a comment on engaging the public. I think there was some concern about social media usage at the beginning. I think that's totally fair, and I love the idea of sending out letters to everybody. But I think social media does add a layer where you can hit more people, and it also allows for NGOs and community groups and Facebook groups and wherever to also disseminate that information. So I think both and kind of thing. The other was a question more specifically for Wood and probably the agencies too. In the cost analyses of the scenarios, the various scenarios, specifically the ones that are like really large-scale treatment, implementation of large-scale treatment technologies, has there been also cost considerations for the disposal of the really concentrated byproducts after treatment? Is that something that's been included in costs, and also has there been a specific mechanism that's been decided on for disposal of those byproducts? And those are just all kind of one question, I guess.
Start with.
So I would say yes, it is considered. There's a lot of details that goes into, costing that out for the disposal specifically. But it is factored into our overall treatment costs for the different treatment technologies. So we're looking at granular activated carbon as well as ion exchange. So question was, are we planning on incinerating? So it depends on the treatment technology. In most cases, yes, that is the kind of standard disposal. But I think that there is some reactivation of carbon being done in different places. So that'd be something that, during the implementation phase could be addressed as well to try and, save on costs or save on, potential additional, putting additional waste back into the environment. I don't know if anybody else have any. Shalene, anything to add?
So it's a really valid question because this is a conceptual drinking water supply plan. It's conceptual in nature in terms of what we've included. So we've included operation and maintenance, disposal of those granular activated carbon units or of the ion exchange resin to what the market industry standard is right now. So like you look at Calgon and the POET systems as an example of what's happening in the East Metro. When they get changed out, they go back to the vendor. That's about where we're at right now. In terms of the details of what's going to happen on implementation, that will happen way beyond us once the communities get their funding and move it forward.
I want to touch base on the first comment on the social media. We do plan using social media. One of the things we talked at the Citizen Business Group is, for instance, the use of Nextdoor and that. I think I'll just speak for MPCA. One of the hard parts on some of the conversations that go on Facebook and that, we can provide information there and link back to certain spots, but we can drop in, give that information, but we can't be there to continue to answer questions. We don't have the bandwidth to do it. And we've seen this in other situations where it gets the impression, well, the agency's there to give the information and they're not there to answer follow-up questions. We just don't have that bandwidth to do it. So it's more so how do we do it in a way that's fulfilling to those users on the media, because we just don't have enough staff to follow numerous Facebook groups or Nextdoor groups. We have, and Carla mentioned it at the Citizen Business Group earlier, when there starts to be a lot of, especially misinformation or confusion, try to reach out, for instance, in the Fridley situation, to the Facebook group there, to leaders to try to straighten that out. But it is something that we're not going to hit perfectly on the head, but it is one of those tools we'll try to use. We just can't be on it all the time. But any advice, especially from those who are on those platforms, how they, get information or questions for the agencies, I think that's, as we continue to evolve and learn how to engage through social media, that's important to get that feedback, what's worked and what hasn't worked.
Other questions or comments from the public? All right, my clock says 10:22. Let's be back at 10:32, please.
Good morning, everybody. Nice to see you today. I'm Rebecca Higgins. I am a professional licensed geologist in the state of Minnesota, and we're here to give you an update on the progress of Project 1007. And so I have a couple of folks with me today who are going to help present this material, and we're going to give you an overview of the technicalities of this project, along with where we've got results and what those look like and what they mean to you, more importantly. So before we get started with the presentation materials, I would like you to note that you have a little 3x5 note card in front of you. We're going to go ahead and ask you to hold all of your questions. So as we're introducing ourselves, go ahead and think of maybe just a few things that you'd like to learn about Project 1007. What answers are you seeking right now, and what can we answer for you? If we don't get to the answers on those note cards by the time we're done talking, I want you to bring up those questions for us. And as we're talking, if you have any kind of question that's germane to this conversation, then please jot that down, and we will try our best to answer those. So we know that there are going to be a lot of questions and concerns about the material we'll present to you today, so we'd like to acknowledge that any of those feelings that you have about this material, we are happy to go about answering questions to the best we can, and we want you to understand that we're working very diligently to find the best fixes to this problem, which is very complex, and you're about to hear why, but certainly finding the best solutions to this issue in the long term. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce First, before I do my introductions, I'm going to do acknowledgments of our partners. So there are many people that have been involved with this project, not the least of which are the folks that are wearing blue polos here today with the name AECOM, AECOM on that. And that's our team, that's our consulting firm that is working with us, but we've also had a number of other partnerships from other organizations, and I'll just mention them now so that we can certainly acknowledge all of their diligent work on this project. We really appreciate our partners. So first of all, we had the Department of Natural Resources at the helm with us, the Minnesota Department of Health as well. The Minnesota Geological Survey has been literally out in the field with us, along with the Department of Health, and the Minnesota Department of Transportation, and of course the Valley Branch Watershed District as well. We've even gone so far as to share some of our actual rocks with the University of Minnesota as well. So we want this to be an educating experience for everybody involved. So with that, I'll go ahead and introduce my counterparts here today. We've got Marie De Los Santos and Amanda Lanning to my right here, also in their blue polos. So easy to find if you have questions later. I'll introduce first Marie. Marie is a geologist with AECOM in their Minneapolis office, where she provides field and technical support for environmental remediation projects throughout Minnesota. She has a bachelor's in marketing from the University of Texas in Austin, a bachelor's in geology from the University of Houston, and a master's in geosciences from the University of Arizona. And Amanda here is a geologist also with the AECOM Minneapolis office, and she's been providing technical support in the field on a variety of remediation projects for 8 years. Ms. Lanning holds a bachelor's degree in geology from Georgia State University, and she's currently certified as a geologist in training in the state of Minnesota. All right, so with that, I'm going to go ahead and get jumping into our material for this project. All right, we're going to go through a number of items today. First, we're going to give you an overview of the project phases and that schedule. We'll talk about the foremost issue, settlement requirements and the language of the settlement, and the location of where our project is in space and time. A complex problem is going to be a deep dive on the complex issues of this entire corridor, but we're going to work from the bottom up here. We're going to go from the below ground investigation that we're working on currently, and then we're going to go back to the results that we had from our first portion of the investigation, and you'll see why this all makes sense at the end. And we're going to talk about those results, but also in the context of the health risks that they pose to anybody in the area. And of course, concluding in next steps. So with that, let's just revisit that 3M settlement language pertaining to Project 1007. So it said, as part of this agreement and order, the PCA will be conducting a source assessment and feasibility study regarding the role of the Valley Branch Watershed District's project known as Project 1007 in the conveyance of PFCs in the environment. So you can see those two pieces of the puzzle, the source assessment and the feasibility study, are really what we're tasked with. The source assessment piece of this puzzle is what we're working on right now. So a little history about Project 1007. Before any man-made conveyance structures or any pipe or conduit or dams were put into this area, the water on the surface of the land flowed naturally to the southeast, but it didn't flow very well. It was very much a system that was much more like a wetland or a marsh and would upwell every time there was heavy precip or heavy rains. And we had an area called the Tri-Lakes area, Lake de Montrevel, Lake Jane, and Lake Olson. In the northwest corner of this picture, that shows an example of that flooding. The water fundamentally moved down here to the southeast, regardless of the system as in its man-made components, but it ponded down here somewhat at the Fallstrom Pond area, and then just fundamentally was one large wetland upwelling with water as water levels rose. This is, again, we're reminded that we're talking about just surface water right now. Up here on the right-hand side of the picture, you can see examples of the way those homes were flooding, and that was part of the impetus or the reason behind the installation of these conveyance systems, the piping and the dams and the like. So what it did is it fundamentally allowed better effective drainage throughout the system. And let's see, Marie is going to go through some of this a little bit more in detail and just touching on the complexities of the issue. But fundamentally, this is something to remember, that the water did not have an outlet. It now has a much more effective route and allows that flooding to be reduced in the area. And it exits out here to the St. Croix River. You can see where it also meets up with Raleigh Creek over here on the left portion of the screen. And we'll talk a bit about the importance of the Raleigh Creek connection to Project 1007 in our investigation. Moving on, we just want to remind you of what the current plume maps look like in the groundwater. Again, these are groundwater plume maps, not surface water. And this is what the PFOS plume maps look like for this portion of the East Metro. You can see here that there are any number of fingers that kind of jettison off of the main impacted areas, and they just simply drain where the geology allows it to drain. Again, this is a subsurface representation or below ground representation of where the plumes are at currently, and this is again just for PFOS. So the three phases of our project include the baseline sampling event, which we conducted this past fall. We'll be talking about those results a little bit later. The beta phase investigation, or the second portion of the investigation. You can think of this very simply as the surface water investigation, the groundwater investigation, and then the focused investigation is our third portion, and that is a combined surface and groundwater investigation, pulling all those components together. And now I'll hand it off to Marie. She's going to talk about the complexity of this issue and all of the challenges we face in identifying solutions.
Okay, thanks, Rebecca. So from the get-go, we've had to ask ourselves, what do we need to consider to better understand the relationship between Project 1007, the setting of the site, and PFAS contaminants? Well, it turns out there are a lot of unique features of the site that add to the complexity and challenges in answering this question. So this diagram here just illustrates some of the overarching topics that we have to deal with, and not everything is listed up here. So for the sake of time, we'll talk about some of the three most important ones. We have surface water flow, groundwater flow, and the geology. So there are differences in the way that water flows on the surface and underground, and those have implications for where PFAS contaminants may migrate. So on the surface, as you've seen in some of the maps here, there are numerous water bodies, and each one serves as a mechanism of storing or transporting water, and thus PFAS contaminants. And there's also a variability in precipitation rates depending on where you are on the site. And with a site this big, all of those things are important to take into account. So as Rebecca mentioned, if we go back in time before Project 1007 was built, surface water flowed to the east, southeast, towards the St. Croix. There, surface water flowed a little bit slower because there were more wetlands present throughout the site. Now, if we go back to after Project 1007 was built, the flow was made more continuous, took on a shorter route, and water was diverted more quickly. Now let's switch to groundwater. So there's not just one, but multiple bedrock aquifers with which the groundwater is stored. Groundwater in the region generally is affected or influenced by large bodies of water like the St. Croix and the Mississippi rivers. So what that looks like in our site is this somewhat imaginary line that bisects the site somewhere between Lake Elmo and Eagle Point Lake. So on the west side of that line, groundwater is flowing to the southwest to the west towards the Mississippi, and on the other side it's flowing southeast towards the St. Croix River. Then there's the geology. So it turns out Washington County has some pretty interesting geology. So there are large bedrock fractures, large cavities in the bedrock, as well as some highly porous bedrock. There's also this large, unique feature that runs straight through the middle of Washington County called a buried bedrock valley. And it's filled with river and glacial sediments of various sizes. So as you can probably imagine, the groundwater has somewhat of a fast lane with which it can flow. And so all of these geologic features just go to show that there are a lot of different conduits with which groundwater can move, and thus has implications of where PFAS can also move. So all of these things are just examples of the layers of complexity that we have to work with. And that is a good reason and supports the need for a more phased investigation approach, which is what we have here on the slide. So the green boxes indicate work that's completed or is currently in progress. And the blue boxes indicate work that is future work. And I'd like to emphasize how imperative it is that we continue on with this future work in order to collect quality, high-resolution data that can fill in any gaps in our understanding in developing a more robust conceptual model and understanding. So as Rebecca mentioned, we started with our baseline sampling investigation on the surface level only. And there we intend to follow up with additional investigations in 2020 and 2021. So we're hoping to understand a little bit more about PFAS and where it's distributed during high flow conditions, low flow conditions, and maybe on a seasonal level if there are differences in PFAS concentrations. We also hope to understand a little bit more about the occurrence distribution of PFAS foam, which will be talked about a little bit later in the presentation. So now we've switched gears and we're looking at the subsurface during our beta site investigation. And basically, each one of these beta sites are scattered throughout the corridor. And in each location, we're drilling deep bedrock wells. And as we're drilling down, we're collecting soil and groundwater samples to better inform us of where to go back and install shallow wells. And this method is called vertical aquifer profiling. So I just want to take a quick minute to point out the key aspect of how long it's taken us to get to this point so far. So the baseline sampling investigation on the surface took 2 full weeks and hundreds of man-hours to plan and implement. And really, it was important that we took the time to collect that data within a constrained time frame so that we can better understand what the trends and what the results are telling us within that time frame. Our beta site investigations, these 4 boxes essentially in green here, we started drilling in November 2019, and it's taken us 7 weeks, and we're still working. So it goes to show that collecting the high quality, high resolution data does take time and effort to complete, but essentially we're working with systems that are well beneath our feet. So it does take a little bit of time. So just to proceed here in the bottom of the flow chart, after our beta site investigations, we'll proceed to the focus investigations, where we'll go to select areas along the corridor and take a closer look at groundwater, surface water interactions and how those interactions may play a part in transporting PFAS contaminants throughout the corridor. Now I'm going to hand it back to Rebecca.
Thank you, Marie. Okay, well, if you're not convinced that it's a complex issue, there's more to come. But first, I will give your brain a break, and I'll give you some visuals as to where we're working right now during this second phase of investigation, the beta phase. This is one of our drilling sites. That's our drilling company, Trout, and they are doing great work out there, even despite the cold and challenging conditions they're working in. This is Lake Elmo. You just flew over the western side of Lake Elmo, and now you're heading towards fundamentally the southeast. And in fact, the water may be moving in the same direction. Fun fact, there's a pipe that goes from Eagle Point Lake and diverts water from Eagle Point Lake underneath Lake Elmo. It's floated down and sunk down to the bottom of Lake Elmo, and daylight's on the other side of Lake Elmo. So Lake Elmo has its own discharge separate from the Eagle Point Lake, which is piped underneath at the bottom of the lake, and then they both discharge on the east side of it. So just a nice little visual to give your brain a break before we give you a little bit more education on the geologic component of this investigation. And with that, here is Amanda.
So here is an aerial image of the wells that we've installed thus far. And as Marie's just showed you guys, this site is incredibly complex. So we have several theories as to how we think PFAS might be moving from the surface into these deep bedrock aquifers. And one of those theories, and where we chose to start this phase of the investigation, is the bedrock valley, that vein that Marie was talking about. So to back up a little bit, what is the bedrock valley? And for those of you who maybe aren't geologists, what is bedrock? So to give you hopefully an easy to understand an analogy, imagine a layered cake. When you look at it as a whole, you see icing, maybe some candles and some sprinkles, but just the icing. When you take a slice, you see layers. You see that icing, you see a cake layer, a frosting layer, another cake layer. This is not unlike how our Earth were to look if we were to cut a slice out of it. Those cake and frosting layers are like our bedrock layers. The cake, which is soft and in theory could hold water, it's like our aquifers. And the frosting, which is dense and sticky, water wouldn't move through it, those are like our confining layers. So looking at the slice of Earth that we've been studying for the past 7 weeks, once again to give you kind of a sense of perspective here, we've got from west to east is 694, Lake Elmo, and then the St. Croix River. And that groundwater divide that Marie mentioned is roughly here-ish, right after Eagle Point Lake. So going back to the cake analogy, you can see once again those layers. So under the ground, some of those layers can hold and transmit water. That's again aquifers, while some of the layers like the frosting would prevent downward movement of water. Those are our confining layers. So what is the bedrock valley? Well, first of all, and just to be clear, the bedrock valley is a buried valley. It is beneath our feet. Well before glaciers were covering Minnesota, we had ancient rivers flowing through the state. They carved out deep valleys into these bedrock layers, and then some of them dried up, leaving behind just those deep valleys, a process very similar to how our Grand Canyon was formed. So fast forward, glaciers arrived, then they melt. When they melted, they dropped everything they were carrying. And by everything, I mean everything. Sand, clays, gravels, boulders, rocks the size of me. And those glacial deposits form our top layer here in Minnesota, our icing. And they also filled in all of those bedrock valleys, including our very own right here under Lake Elmo. So once again, you can see we've positioned all of our monitoring wells in and around this valley. The first big thing that we got from at least this stage in the process was that those glacial layers, those everything layers, varied a lot. And this unpredictability suggests a lack of continuity within any of the layers within those glacial deposits. So if we think we're seeing a confining layer, meaning we think it's going to prevent downward movement of water, that layer probably isn't continuous either. And if it's not continuous, it's not going to be an effective confining unit. And then to add to this, one thing we did see generally across the board was that the bottommost 10 to 20 feet of these glacial layers predominantly consisted of sands and gravels. And this is an important point because sands and gravels don't work as confining units. Water will flow right through them. So when we ask how might PFAS contamination be migrating from the surface into those first bedrock aquifers, into that first cake layer, the answer could be right through the glacial deposits. So the second big takeaway is that the bedrock valley and its extent is poorly understood. Now, why do we care about understanding the extent of the bedrock valley? Well, we know we have PFAS contamination in the surface layers. We know we have it in the bedrock aquifers, and we know we have it in the deep bedrock aquifers. What we don't know is the pathway it's taking to get there. And one somewhat obvious, at least to us, pathway is the actual valley, straight from the glacial deposits horizontally into these deep units. But the only way to confirm that is to collect data, and by data I mean groundwater data, within and around the valley, which means we need to understand the exact shape, how deep, how wide of this bedrock valley. So looking back at our cross-section, which we had well before we drilled any of these holes, you can see why we thought at least 1, 2, maybe 3 holes would go down to the center of this valley. Well, it turns out none of them were. They weren't even off-center of it. So we know that the bedrock valley is much narrower than we expected, which means it could also be deeper or shallower. So once again, it may look like we already have a lot of information like this cross-section, but much of that information is a product of interpolation and extrapolation. It's connecting the dots. And if we want to have an accurate and an effective understanding of how PFAS is moving through that subsurface, we need to have information of the highest resolution possible. In other words, a lot more dots. So the third and final big takeaway that we've got here is again related to this valley. When those rivers carved out the valley, we think that they affected the edges of the valley as well. They were weathered, fractured, broken up. So in addition to the glacial valley itself being a pretty feasible direct pathway, we think the fractured zone surrounding it can provide another potential pathway for PFAS, but this time vertically, from the shallow aquifers into the deep aquifers, right through what are supposed to be confining layers. Which brings me to, I think, possibly the most important observation we've made thus far, which is that one of those layers, this lower Prairie du Chien, the Oneota, was heavily fractured throughout, which begs the question, with all those fractures and holes and cracks, is it actually acting as a confining layer? Is it actually preventing the downward movement of water and water with PFAS into these deep aquifers? So in an attempt to answer that question, we actually set 2 of our 7 wells in this confining layer on either side of the bedrock valley. So, and with that, I will hand the slides. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot one more. Hopefully you understand a little bit of the how and why. This is a little more of the how. We actually looked at the rocks. And if you feel like playing a geologist, we have a few rocks around the room that you can take a look at and see kind of what we were looking at underground. So with that, I will give the presentation back to Rebecca, who will take you out of the subsurface.
Thank you, Amanda. Yes, indeed. Rocks are behind Kirk sitting right here in the upper part of the room, and then also outside of the room, right above the water fountains, there's a box of a whole bunch of rocks. And there you can see all of those holes and get an understanding of how that water might get moved vertically downward through the subsurface where we think it should be confining, but indeed we're finding that it is certainly less than. Okay, so moving on, just giving you a sense then of where we're at. We came from the subsurface, and now we're going to talk about our results from that above ground work, that surface water work. So this was the first phase of the investigation. This was our portion of the work where we went out and sampled over 100 samples throughout the entire corridor of Project 1007. And these analytical results are going to be presented to you in a way that hopefully you can understand throughout the entire corridor. We broke it into boxes. You can see depicted by the green boxes here across the entire corridor. That upper Tri-Lakes area is the portion of the system there that comes from the DeMontreville, Lake Olson, Lake Jane area past Washington County landfill, and then meets up with Raleigh Creek there, right at Tablin Park. The Raleigh Creek portion of the site goes from just past the Oakdale disposal site to the west, and then where, again, it meets up just past that confluence or convergence point where it meets up with the Project 1007 and then heads into the Eagle Point Lake area, and that's then the Lake Elmo Park Reserve portion of the investigation. So Tri-Lakes area, Raleigh Creek, Lake Elmo Park area, and then onward to the much larger chunk of the system, just by miles purely, the West Lakelands area, and that goes from about the Royal Golf Club area all the way out to just before where the project discharges to the St. Croix River. Okay, so that's our general sampling areas. You can see by the graphs with this the number of samples that we collected in each area, and here we sampled for water, sediment, and where we found it, foam on the surface of the water. So let's get into the results. All right. Looking at just surface water results for just PFOS. These results show you by those same boxes on a graph. The concentration here on the left side of the graph is in parts per billion. And you can see the Tri-Lakes area down here, the Raleigh Creek area, Lake Elmo Park area, West Lakeland area, and the St. Croix River. Just for your reference point as well, you should know that this is about 14 total miles as the crow flies for this entire project corridor. So in this graph, you can see where our significant impacts were found, at least as they relate to the rest of the corridor. And not surprisingly, we found it highest in the Raleigh Creek area. Okay, but next question you're going to ask yourself, or maybe me, is, well, how high is high? So let's give you a sense of what other bodies of water in the metro area use for what are called the water quality criteria. Water quality criteria are generated by the PCA in a way to develop a number of value that we want to keep water bodies, we want to have within water bodies to maintain fish at a safe level, so we aren't eating fish that have lived and swam and drank contaminated water, okay? So the water quality criteria is something that we have for other bodies of water in the metro, but we haven't yet developed it for this area because it's site-specific. So this area is currently under development. Our risk assessors are working right now as we speak to develop these numbers for this corridor, okay? So, but just as comparison, for two other bodies of water in the metro area, Bedeh-Makaska and Mississippi River Pool 2 have established criteria from back, I think they date back to about 2011. And those numbers range from 0.011 to 0.014 parts per billion. And as you can see, that little line flew in right here at the bottom of that graph. It just gives you a sense of where that water quality criteria number sits in comparison to the values that we found in this system during this portion of investigation. Again, this is just for surface water. Interestingly, we do have sediment numbers. I'll get into that in just a moment. But then moving on from here, where we found foam on the surface during this investigation, we did sample it. The science has been emerging throughout the past, I wouldn't even say more than a year to 2 years at best, for PFAS-containing foam that can occur at the surface of any water body. We all know that you'll see foam on any given water body at the bottom of a dam, near a rapids. It naturally forms on its own, so foam exists on its own in nature. That's to be expected. All the organic material in a body of water likes to aggregate up and get agitated and turn into foam. We expect to see that anywhere. However, in this corridor where we knew PFAS-containing foam could exist because we knew we had impacted surface water, we also thought it prudent to sample that foam. So we did. And we sampled it in these 3 areas. There was a total of 5 samples taken across 3 general areas. So the locations of that are pointed to with these arrows, and that was all within the Raleigh Creek area as our primary focus where we saw it, and particularly after precipitation and wind events, and I'll get into that next. So how does the foam form? So foam forms at what's called the surface microlayer. It's the tiniest little fraction of water at the very top of the water where the air meets the water. And that's called that surface microlayer. It's not thicker than an eyelash. And in that layer, PFAS contaminants like to flow. They just like to exist there. That's because of the nature, the physiochemical properties of that compound. That's a fancy way of saying they like to surf. So you can see on this image that these caterpillar-looking images are examples of a PFAS compound. The red dots on those caterpillars are the head of the compound. The yellow dots are the tails. And the head likes to stay in the water. The tail likes to be above the water, in the air. So that's exactly why they surf. They like to exist right at the surface. So we expected to see PFAS contaminants in that zone and easily agitated into foam, which makes sense. So this picture on the upper left is called a micelle, or it's at least a bubble of PFAS. PFAS likes to get agitated and likes to aggregate and even concentrate in these foam areas. So that's how PFAS travels. This is what it looked like in real life. This is the real picture of a location of a sample of PFAS-containing foam. So you can see that it can be mixed in with all the naturally occurring vegetation. It can be really gross looking fundamentally. It can be brown. It can look a bit more white. It just depends on the circumstances in which it exists. So that PFAS-containing foam looks like this. If you were to maybe just walk by it, you can see that there's little rapids here, and you can see that it's mixed in with that vegetation just like any other foam, and you cannot tell the difference between a PFAS-containing foam and a naturally occurring foam. They look identical. It also depends on the circumstance. If you have a wider open body of water where maybe nothing is getting in the way of that foam from forming, that can look a little bit different and a bit more distinguishable. It has a bit more different characteristic or look to it. But this is out here sampling the surface water. You can see these little tiny aggregates of bubbles. flowing down the middle of the stream, those are what can accumulate into a nice puffy little pocket of foam where the water quiets and over towards the shoreline, towards little areas where after maybe a rapids, it is a little eddy of quiet water. That's what PFAS containing foam can look like if you put it in a bag to sample it and then give it a white background. You can see how much darker it looks. So in its own natural setting, it can look much more white. That's because it has a darker background from the water and the natural material around it. If you put it in a bag and give it a white background, it can look much more brown. So with that, this is a complicated slide that all I want you to take away from it is that simply these are the concentrations of at least a few of those samples. I want you to understand the difference between the surface water sample, and here's an example of where we had 1.54 parts per billion in the surface water sample directly below where we had foam. So then where we sampled the foam in that same location at its highest concentration in the corridor, we found concentrations of PFOS at 13,800 parts per billion. So that gives you a sense of the difference. Now we expect the PFAS to concentrate in these little aggregated foam pockets, and that's a major difference between the surface water PFAS impacts and the foam containing PFAS. So with that, I just want you to understand also, we're not the only ones in this PFAS containing foam situation. The neighbors to our east, Wisconsin and Michigan, have also had experience with this as of late. This is an example of what they've experienced in Wisconsin, and here we have PFAS on a large creek, PFAS foam on a large creek in those first two pictures, in a drainage ditch in the third, and then here in the last, where it's less impeded by any of the naturally occurring material, whether it's leaf debris or sticks or anything. It can foam up into much more billowy, meringue-looking, shaving cream-looking foam. So you can tell it's much more unnatural looking than if it were to occur in a small pocket where it's laden with all of that debris in a creek, let's say. So that's Wisconsin's experience. To give you a sense of what they're experiencing in Michigan, they've had it, on larger bodies of water, where in this case on the bottom left, it was billowed up next to a dock, and that foam was from multiple PFAS sources in that area. And that was about a foot thick. So you can get this billowing up quite tall, at least in places where it's unimpeded there again. You can have foam that is frozen. It's a very interesting texture that we see. These are locations where Michigan has confirmed PFAS-containing foam. And then this colorful image on the picture here is just some research that Michigan's been able to do with some funding that they've got for explicitly understanding better how this is getting into the environment and how it exists. That's some infrared camera imaging, that research work, again, that Michigan is doing. So just to give you a sense of what it looks like in other locations. But let's talk a little bit about the risk assessment piece of this. And I do have some Department of Health folks in the room that if you'd like to ask more detailed questions about, I'm sure they'll be happy to stand up and give their opinion on it. Fundamentally, though, when it comes to PFAS containing foam, we want the public to understand one thing primarily. Just avoid it. If you think that it's in an area where you know that there is PFAS impacts, try to avoid the foam if you think it could contain it. Treat it no differently than you do blue-green algae. If in doubt, stay out. Avoid it if you can. If you do come in contact with it on occasion, or your pet happens to come in contact with it, simply wash yourself or your pet off with soap and water. Rinse it off. It will certainly come off of you, and we don't expect it to absorb through your skin to any certain degree that would cause any kind of significant risk. So fundamentally, I want you to understand that if you do come in contact with it, wash off. Avoid it, though, first and foremost. Surface water concentrations, as a reminder, in water tend to be much, much lower than the concentrations in the foam. And so that's an important thing to remember. We're going to continue collecting much more additional data to understand this better, and as the science emerges around this issue, certainly get at how we can find some solutions to it. Of course, we'll continue with our risk assessment pieces, and not the least of which is the recreational risk. So with that, there's a number of risk assessment pieces of this puzzle, and I think we've called it a complex problem for a while now. Now you're getting the sense of it. So not only do we have the recreational risks from these contaminants, but we also have a number of other receptors or ecological, human, and other receptors that we want to be able to evaluate, meaning how could this possibly pose a risk to any one thing, whether it's people or animals. In this case, we can see examples of where we have sediment, soil, surface water, and foam risk levels. We're in development of the foam and the surface water components of that right now as we speak. We already have established sediment and soil values for PFAS in this corridor, and some of those can be site-specific. In some cases, they can be applied to the whole state. So the risk assessment piece of this puzzle, I won't delve into any further. I would actually hand it off to an entire another presentation on risk assessment values, because that does deserve its own discussion. So what else are we going to do about this? Well, our next steps are to continue this investigation. As you've seen, we're in the middle of that second phase of investigation. We're going to continue forward with the focused investigation, and that'll combine surface water and groundwater findings in order to better find solutions at the end of the day. We're going to communicate all of this out to you and everybody who'd like to know as often as needed. Coordinating, we're going to work within our own programs and across agencies. As you remember, our partners in this are many, and we intend to continue working with all of those experts as much as possible to find those best solutions. And then, of course, we're going to continue evaluating. We're going to continue evaluating fundamentally the Oakdale disposal site and those groundwater controls and how they're being effective in containing these impacts along this corridor. And of course, then that last piece, that health and environmental risk assessment piece, what does this mean? How can we better protect our drinking water, our groundwater, and our ecosystems in general? So with that, some of the concluding statements I'd like you to walk away with today include, first, that background piece. What have we done in a year? If you'd like to know how far we've gotten in a year, and actually, we've only been at this about 7-8 months as a team for the investigation piece of this. You folks have been meeting for a year, though, so if I were you, I'd say, well, what have you gotten done in the year that I've been meeting? And these are 3 things I want you to remember for the Project 1007. We have a roadmap for a comprehensive investigation, a full-fledged, deep dive investigation. We have the first phase of that investigation complete, and we're working in the midst of that second phase right now as we speak. We literally have drillers out in the field right now. So beyond that, though, the investigation will continue through 2020 and 2021. And that it's a complex problem. There is no simple fix to this forever chemical. There is also PFAS-containing foam that we found as a new finding, and it was in what we expected to be a PFAS-contaminated surface water. So where we know we have PFAS impacts in surface water, we expect to find PFAS foam in the right circumstance. So you should know that that is a major finding, and that, of course, fundamentally, people and pets should avoid the foam at all costs, and if you do come in contact with it, wash it off. So understand that we certainly have been working very, very hard to find answers to this problem, and we will continue to share this information. We can talk your ear off about this issue, and we could talk all day and maybe night about our investigation procedures, and if you stick around for the SG1 meeting, subgroup 1 meeting, you can certainly hear an even greater dive on the geology components of this and a bit more detail from the analytical standpoint. So that's going to be where we're going next in our meeting this afternoon. If you should feel the need or want to stick around for that, certainly you're welcome. Otherwise, I'm certainly happy to take any of the questions that you've written down now.
I have 2 questions. The first one relates back to Amanda's presentation, where you talked about going to the deeper level of the Prairie du Chien, and I'm wondering how deep you will go. Like, will you go, for example, to the St. Lawrence if you think that's going to be a valley that lets stuff through?
Great question, and it's geology. Do you want to? Okay, go ahead.
So one of our goals with this investigation is to actually eventually vertically delineate the contamination. So we would want to go at some point all the way down to the tunnel city. And if that means going further, if the contamination is there too, then we would do that as well. But that's not at this stage yet, but that's definitely in our plans. So.
Yes.
My second question relates more to trying to anticipate questions from the public. So we know there's the foam in Raleigh Creek, and people should stay away from that. Perhaps there's foam in Lake Elmo, too. That needs to be tested, and people should stay away from that. But the other water body that came to mind is the swim pond in Lake Elmo Park Preserve. And I know that's man-made, but I just wonder if there's been testing there or what we should tell folks about swimming there. I don't even know if foam gets created there. But just, again, one of those things, I guess, that I would maybe anticipate from the public this summer.
Jim,
Hi, Jim Kelly from the Department of Health. I know the swim pond is artificial and it's fed through wells. Sorry, it's fed through dedicated wells that I think go through some sort of treatment system. So there really isn't any concerns with that. It's a completely separate system from anything natural out there, intentionally so. And we'll be, as Rebecca said, we'll be doing some with the additional data, we'll do some additional risk assessment to make sure we're not missing anything, but that's basically what we can say at this point. So we wouldn't have any concerns about the park reserve.
Did you say that the big danger would be if it was ingested?
Correct. It's not going to be absorbed through the skin. So it's in a situation where someone would literally have to be ingesting it for it to be a health concern. I think pets and so forth are probably going to be probably bigger questions than people in terms of potential for pets to get into that. That's certainly possible, but I think the same recommendations apply there.
Okay, other questions here? Clint?
So the project costs associated with this, I liked Monica's description of the project, 1007. It sounds much better. Will that be against the settlement, or is this a separate funding stream?
I'm looking at Gary because I know he can answer this to the best degree possible. And I'm going to hand the mic all the way back. Or Kirk, you want to answer?
That's called managing up. So the settlement actually specifically calls out this investigation as part of Priority 1. So this effort is funded through the settlement.
Maybe a deeper answer to that too would be that, as you remember, the language was for source assessment and feasibility study, and this is the source assessment piece. The feasibility study yet has not been started, and that will be a follow-on to our initial investigation results. You don't do a feasibility study until you have adequate information and that robust data set in order to build a feasibility study that would be appropriate. The remedial piece is not defined in the settlement. Do you want to say any more about that?
So the letter that MPCA sent to 3M to look at the Oakdale disposal site is separate from the settlement. It is the ongoing remedial activities under the consent order.
I have two questions. One is a little bit more technical. Maybe you can just give a quick answer to it. Why is the foam concentration higher in PFOA and PFOS versus PFBA and PFBS? I noticed that in your slide that those two are the highest concentrations, even though they're probably not the most mobile or the most prevalent in the environment.
We don't know. Yes, but I start by saying I am not a chemist nor an engineer. I am a geologist. So if Jim, do you want to talk about fate and transport?
I think the answer to that is it's because of the chain length of those PFOS and PFOA make them more likely to behave and form those layers. It's the length of that tail that Rebecca described that dictates how much it wants to sit on that surface layer and be partly in the water and partly out. PFBA, as we know, is a lot more water soluble because it's got a much shorter tail, so it's much easier for it to stay in the water and not form this layer on top. We've kind of known about these properties for a while, and this behavior isn't necessarily a surprise. We just never had a way to look for it before. So I think it presents an opportunity, I hope at some point, to actually be able to capture this material a little bit more efficiently than pumping it out of groundwater.
So now that we've kind of identified this next scientific development of foam, are you guys looking at a larger expanse of testing the East Metro for foam properties, not just in this 1007 area? Obviously, because the East Metro has a lot of surface water, groundwater interactions where this foam could be presenting itself, and it could, lead to maybe advisories in other areas.
We will do additional sampling throughout this Project 1007 corridor where it makes sense, where it's appropriate. And beyond 1007, we would have to know that, or have to at least have a reason to believe that we would have a PFAS source and a PFAS, a reason for PFAS to be in the surface water to begin with. So if we don't have reason to believe that the PFAS is in a surface water, I can't imagine going out to just sample foam as it sits naturally occurring. We wouldn't expect it to be there. So we will only apply sampling where it's logical and appropriate. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so in our counterpart states, Wisconsin and Michigan, they've done quite a bit of work to understand exactly where it occurs and how it occurs. They can get a report of it and a phone call saying, please come out and sample this location, and they run out there to sample it, and it's gone. So PFAS in foam can aggregate and concentrate into these pockets, and then it can continue moving because it's in a moving body of water, and then it can dissolve back in. And then you can have a precip event, a wind or wave action of any kind, and that will concentrate it again up into the foam, and it can move and then dissolve back in. And there's no reason that we would have no reason to believe that it couldn't continue moving that way or behaving that way. So it makes it very elusive. It makes it something you can see 1 minute and maybe it's gone the next. Or maybe you get a major rain event or major wind event, and then that billows up a whole bunch of it. And then you would really notice it, obviously. So.
Yeah, I think my question is about the formation of that foam. You said it's foam is a naturally occurring phenomenon in water bodies. But I think now the question that people will have is, this seems to imply that where you see foam, there's a likelihood of PFAS being present, because now it's, people are going to jump to that or whatever. Are we seeing more foam because PFAS is present, or are we just thinking to test foam for the presence of PFAS? Do you know what I'm saying?
I think that goes back to the same point of we should only expect to see PFAS containing foam where we know we have PFAS impacted surface water, fundamentally. It just wants to travel there. It wants to aggregate and concentrate up into these foams, and that's fundamentally it. I don't know that you would necessarily expect to see more foam in nature because PFAS exists in nature in multiple forms. I simply think it's this standard connection between surface water, where you know it's impacted, it could form foam. So. Lots of research yet to be done.
I think a little bit back to the earlier questions where there is foam potentially found anywhere in the East Metro and these communities, and knowing that it's going to be difficult and in some cases not at all able to sample it, we're going with the same message we are with blue-green algae, which is stay out. So I think folks, while we found it in Raleigh Creek, if there is foam seen in other parts of the East Metro, that same message is to be applied, stay out of the foam. Just like we would if you found blue-green algae in various parts of the state and not being able to identify by sight whether it's least toxic or more toxic for pets or humans. And so it's our message to make sure that we're protecting and giving that advice to all residents just so they have it and not rely on us being able to determine that piece of foam was PFAS elevated levels or not.
When we had this discussion yesterday, I was kind of under the impression that I don't know if this has actually been observed before or not. It just so happened this project was out doing that sampling along Raleigh Creek, had a big rain event, which caused the turbulence and therefore the foam formation, and they happened to collect it. And I don't know, was that already in people's minds that this foam could potentially not just be naturally occurring, but also would have this potential? I'm curious if we'd actually observed foam along that route area again.
Yeah, I think the timeline of this went something like you would expect foam to be naturally occurring anywhere in any surface water. So we saw foam before the major rain event while we were out there sampling. So you would expect to see that. The science had been developing throughout this process and the communication with other states as well. And so that gave us a reason to. And we can talk a little bit more about the other locations that we've seen foam and sampled it if we'd like to. This is all really developing, generating sort of organically, no pun intended, all at the same time. So we expected to see foam out there. Then we found out, well, you might want to sample foam as well because other states are doing this as well, and it makes sense where you have or should have PFAS impacted surface water. So then we also happened to have a major rain and wind event while we were out there doing that sampling, and that just sort of was a natural another reason to sample it. So anything more on that? If that's satisfactory. Any other questions? Any other thoughts? All right. Well, hopefully you understand the complexity of the problem now. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, we just have some comments on next steps from Terrell, and then we'll see if there are any final questions, comments from the public, and we'll be done. Sorry. A little snug.
All right. So we just wanted to revisit next steps, so where we are and where we're going in this process. All right, so this is our high-level timeline again. So expedited projects, we are hoping to share that the final decisions, I think, in the next couple weeks. So that should be out pretty soon. And for the drinking water projects, I think you all know where we are currently with the conceptual drinking water supply plan. Just other things that are on the horizon. So we are planning to start up subgroup 2, which is going to be focused on water conservation projects. So still kind of that other piece of the priority 1 agreement, or priority 1 in the agreement. We thought that we would wait to start that up until after the conceptual drinking water supply plan is finalized, since there'll be a lot of stuff over the next few months. And we also are planning to start up subgroup 3 as well. That'll be focused on the natural resource projects, which is priority 2. So that'll be, in the next, in about 6 months from now. So on the horizon. All right, and then we've already talked about a lot of the public engagement piece, but and some of these other things, but just to highlight a few things over the next few months. So again, in February, we will be distributing the full preliminary results from the scenarios and the modeling. So we'll be getting that out before the February work group meeting, and then discussing it at the work group meeting. In March, that's when the co-trustees will be meeting with the LGUs, and we'll be doing the evaluation. And in March, we'll be, at the work group meetings, we'll be circulating back to the informational and listening sessions with the public that happened in February. Then looking to April, we will be distributing the draft conceptual drinking water supply plan to the work groups and subgroup 1 before the April meeting, and discussing feedback on that draft plan in April. And during the same time, we'll also be distributing that draft to the public and having a 30-day comment period, with comments due at the beginning of May, or the middle of May. And more public meetings then. And then in May, to finalize a conceptual drinking water supply plan. And then another set of public meetings at that point too, once we finalize the plan. And then June and beyond is then transitioning over to starting to think about water conservation projects and natural resource projects. That'll be led by subgroup, or supported by subgroup 2 and subgroup 3. So then near term, be on the lookout for the full scenario results, which will essentially be more filled out version of chapter 7 that we distributed a couple weeks ago. So it'll be filling in those placeholders there. And that'll be out before the work group meetings. Any questions?
Can you go back a slide? In May, it says present final CDWSP and decision. Isn't it the decision really the good, better, best recommendations? I mean, is there really actually, why is the word decision there? Because I thought it was supposed to be recommendations. Or decision on what the recommendations are. Is that what that means?
So I have those good, better, and best in April sent out. But at the end of the day, we have to sign contracts and funding agreements to pick one project. And so that's the date of in May is making those final decisions on what is the project to move forward so local governments can start implementing it. So narrowing down the good, better, best to one that's actually being implemented. The question is there only one? I mean, at a point, if there's two different ways to treat groundwater for a community, they're going to have to, they can only build one. So the good, better, best may have multiple ways to address that. You know, maybe it's a shared system or one treatment system for their city or three. We've got to pick one so that the city knows what to move forward with in terms of funding, a local unit of government.
But it'll likely be like multiple projects across the whole East Metro area.
Sorry.
That's what I was trying to get.
Yep.
Sorry, yes. All 14 communities will have a decision on how to move forward.
So relative to the comment period on the conceptual drinking water supply plan, will this take the formality that, for instance, when we do our comprehensive plan, comments are usually submitted in writing? You know, it's a formal process. So how do you anticipate communities will give feedback? Will it be a formal in writing submission? I mean, obviously we always have this meeting and these are informal comments, but what are you thinking about each of us saying we agree on these, but we disagree on these? Do these things need to be from our city councils or county boards or townships? Tell me a little bit about the level of formality you're looking for from the comments.
So on the first phase, the listening sessions, they can be pretty informal. I think we have up there on the previous presentation, April 15th through May 15th is a formal public comment period, and that would be written comments. If you so choose to put in, we probably expect everyone to put in written comments. That'll be their chosen form, but if they don't want to do and just communicate it verbally with us, that's fine. Whether that's official resolution of the city or comments written in, that's up to you. But we have multiple ways to get information to us. The work group meetings, if you want that to be the only way, or formal written comments if you'd like through that public process too.
So what you're saying in a way is you just want written documentation.
You can, yeah. If a community doesn't and likes all three of them and fine with it, they don't have to, put in written comments.
Anything else? All right. Thanks.
Any final questions or comments from members of the public? All right, thank you very much. Have a great month.